Hello everyone and welcome to my talk. We are going to be talking about yeasty beastie, dandruff, cradle cap, and seb derm, short for seborrheic dermatitis. So if you guys have watched my other videos, you know that when I am talking about a dermatologic disease, we want to get to the root cause. So we've got to start with the pathophysiology. So that is what we're going to do today. So we're going to start talking about an organism by the name of Malassezia. And if you haven't heard about Malassezia before, you're going to hear me mention it about a million times today. You're going to know all about it by the end of today's talk. And what is Malassezia? Well, they are lipophilic yeasts. So yeasts are fungal organisms and they eat sebum. So here we're looking at a picture of a hair follicle. And we can see that within the hair follicle, there's something called a sebaceous gland. And that sebaceous gland is responsible for producing sebum. Sebum is just an oil. And that's what Malassezia eats. So Malassezia lives on top of the skin, on top of the stratum corneum, or right at the entrance to the hair follicle in what's called the infundibulum. And it's totally normal to have Malassezia yeast. In fact, all warm-blooded animals have Malassezia growth. So your dog, your cat, an elephant, a horse, a seal, everybody's got Malassezia growing on them. But what's so complicated with this organism is that it occupies both healthy skin and diseased skin. So its role as either a commensal or pathogenic organism is complex. And we don't always understand, why does good Malassezia go bad? But we're going to be looking at some of those issues today. So this is a picture of the skin microbiome, and myco meaning fungal. So usually I think when we talk about the skin microbiome, people are automatically thinking about bacteria, which, there's a good reason for that. We do have a lot of bacteria on our skin, but there's also these fungal organisms, the mycobiome. So yes, there's a fungus among us. And in this chart, you will see different areas of the body, and then there's kind of a color coding, and there's the site characteristics. And you'll see the green is oily. So the oily spots tend to be like the face, scalp, neck, top of the body. And what this oiliness is really referring to is just how much sebum is naturally produced. So we produce a lot of sebum up in these upper areas of the body. And incidentally, that is where Malassezia really likes to grow and hang out. That makes sense, right? We like to be where our food source is. And then there's other parts of the body that are more moist or dry. We can get Malassezia there as well, but we see the heaviest concentration of Malassezia in the oily spots, the high sebum producing areas. And incidentally, that's also where we tend to see acne. So we don't tend to see acne, on the palms. There's not enough sebum. We're going to see it on these high sebum producing areas that we talked about. Now, when I say Malassezia, I'm talking actually about a lot of different species. There are 18 species that we have found on human bodies. They're listed here. But then there's also a species of Malassezia that tend to be specific to animals. So for example, Malassezia equina, we find on horses. We can get cross-pollinated with each other by our pets and stuff like that. But in general, there's kind of human species and animal species. Now it is really Malassezia mayhem on the skin. So we talked about the skin microbiome, the fungal biome is really dominated by Malassezia. From 50 to 80% of the fungal organisms living on our skin, it's Malassezia. And when we look at the genomic material, we talked about there's a lot of bacteria. In fact, only 5 to 10% of the genomic material on skin is fungal. So that makes it seem like, oh, okay, well, I guess maybe we should just pay attention to the bacterial side more. But here's the thing. The size of Malassezia are significantly larger than its bacterial counterparts, up to 8 times as big. So the active biomass of our fungal organisms on the skin, it's likely much greater than 10% of what's happening on the skin microbiome. So we really do need to pay attention to the fungal piece, and we're going to be looking at all of those impacts today. So you will certainly hear the term Malassezia from me a lot, and then maybe you've heard the term Pityriasis, and not sure, well, what's the difference between Pityriasis and Malassezia? Well, your confusion you would not be alone in because it confused researchers. And what the actual answer is that Malassezia species are dimorphic. That it means that it can exist in a yeast phase and a mycelial phase. But originally, when we had a microscope and we were discovering microorganisms, researchers and scientists thought that these were two separate organisms. So in 1874, we identified Malassezia, and it was in the mycelial form. And then in 1950, researchers saw the yeast form, and they named it Pityriasis, thinking, oh, this is a completely different organism. They didn't understand that this species is dimorphic and it can take on two different forms. In 1977, we realized, oh, this is the same organism, but it wasn't until 1986 that these two genera were unified and brought together. But you're still going to see a lot of information where it's listed as Pityriasis and sometimes Malassezia, and just know that it's the same organism, and we kind of just refer to it as Malassezia now. So Malassezia, we said it's normal to have it, but when it kind of goes awry and it triggers inflammation, there's a lot of mechanisms going on in the body for how the body is reacting to the Malassezia and triggering inflammation. So Malassezia can secrete lipases. Lipases are, of course, enzymes that break down fat. And why is Malassezia doing this? Well, we said it eats the sebum, right? In order to eat the sebum, it needs to break down the fat in the sebum, so it's using lipases. But it can modify the sebum lipid profile of the skin in ways that are irritating, and it can elevate free fatty acids like oleic acid. Oleic acid is found in high concentrations in olive oil, and it's known that high oleic acid oils can cause inflammation and irritation to the system. Phospholipase, which is a lipase that it secretes, can cause the release of arachidonic acid, which of course is inflammatory. Sebum can also produce toxic metabolites, and it can generate ROS, or reactive oxygen species, and that will cause oxidative stress to local tissues. So we see how Malassezia can cause inflammation to the skin. And there's a lot of different immune responses that we can have to Malassezia. It's not just one pathway. For example, IgG, immunoglobulin G. We find levels of Malassezia-specific IgG in the serum of healthy patients, and it mirrors the population densities. So those with more Malassezia have more Malassezia-specific IgG, and those with less Malassezia colonization have less Malassezia-specific IgG. We produce complement in reaction to Malassezia, so C3. Deposits of C3 are present in SD, seborrheic dermatitis lesions. We're going to talk about sebderm in a minute. And those areas of complement deposit are located just around the collections of Malassezia cells. They're not present in the uninvolved skin. And then we have a whole host of inflammatory cytokines that are produced in response to Malassezia inflammation. We have IL-1 alpha, IL-1 beta, IL-4, IL-6, IL-8, IL-12, TNF alpha, interferon gamma, right? Lots of different inflammatory responses. And then let's talk about the Th17 pathway, and we'll look at a chart of this in a minute. But Th17 and Malassezia. So we know that we also have a Th17 response to fungal organisms in Malassezia. It was a study done in a mouse model, and it showed that it's this IL-23, IL-17 pathway that controls fungal colonization, and it's what's driving part of the Malassezia-induced inflammation. Mice that were deficient in IL-17A through F or IL-23 had uncontrolled Malassezia growth on their skin, so they couldn't get it under control. And IL-1 beta, IL-6, and IL-17 were upregulated in Malassezia-exposed skin compared to uninfected skin. And just as a reminder of our immunology, this is the pathway for activating T helper cells. So when we first create a T cell, it's what we call a naive T cell. It's like asking the body, where's the problem? What do you need me to be? And then I can know what I need to go fight. And then it becomes activated. And what activates it are these dendritic cells, which are information passing cells in the body. And all of our organ systems that interface with the outside world have dendritic cells. So what do I mean by organ systems that interface with outside world? Well, it's anything that will be in contact with the outside world. So certainly our skin, right? But also our respiratory tract. So I just breathed in air from the outside and could have been exposed to viruses or pollens or something. So our respiratory tract. And of course, our digestive tract, right? Every time we eat, drink, or swallow saliva, we're bringing outside world into the body. So all of these organ systems will have information passing cells, dendritic cells. And when we see a problem, it's going to activate that naive T cell. And once activated, it will go down a specific pathway to fulfill its destiny. And we can see here that Th17 is the pathway for fungal reactions and at mucocutaneous sites. So that would be respiratory, gut, skin. And, we saw on the other page that we've proven that there is a Th17 response to Malassezia. Okay, so let's talk about some conditions that are induced by Malassezia. And there are many. So the one we're going to really talk about heavily today is Seborrheic Dermatitis, and Seb Capitis. We're going to get into that a lot. There can be eye gland and dry eye and eyelid gland dysfunction. There can be co-infection with things like psoriasis and eczema. We can get Malassezia or Pityriasis folliculitis, which is a fungal form of acne, and something called tinea versicolor, which now has been renamed to Pityriasis versicolor. So we're going to drill down and focus in on a couple of these. Let's start out with seborrheic dermatitis, and you're going to hear me and other professionals shorten it to sebderm. So what is sebderm? Well, it's scaling and inflammation on areas of the body rich in sebaceous glands or sebum, such as the face, scalp, and upper trunk. So we looked at those areas on the the microbiome chart. So with the face, it tends to occur in the nasolabial fold. So that's this area here, in the eyebrows, the anterior hairline, so up here, and the glabella, which is right in here. Really common to see sebderm problems there. And basically we know that Malassezia is the problem in seborrheic dermatitis. Again, we're not exactly sure why this is happening. We all have Malassezia living on us. We all don't have sebderm. So why do certain individuals have it when others don't? It's not entirely clear, but we'll look at some theories. And the SD, the sebderm lesions, show an increase of all of those cytokines that we talked about previously in the epidermis and around the follicles of the diseased skin. So we're having a huge inflammatory response. Again, IL-1, 2, 4, 6, 10, 12, interferon gamma, TNF alpha, Th17, a whole host of immune responses. Complement. So in adults, sebderm is considered a chronic or relapsing condition featured by erythematous patches with flaky, large, oily, or dry scales in those sebum-rich areas. So you'll see here, right, we're getting these flaky red patches and with scaling. So the most common location to see seborrheic dermatitis is on the face. One study logged it as 87.7%. The scalp is next, 70.3%. We call it dandruff in adults and cradle cap in infants. We're going to talk about each condition a little bit further. The upper trunk can be a common area, but we see that the lower extremities, so the legs and upper extremities, the arms, much less common. Again, these are not big sebum producing areas, so we're seeing Malassezia colonization in the areas that are rich in sebum production. So let's talk about dandruff, and the technical term is seborrheic capitis in adults. Dandruff is a big problem. It affects 50% of the adult population worldwide at some point, and Americans spend $300 million annually on over-the-counter products to treat scalp itching and flaking. Prevalence by age, so it would start at around puberty. And then the prevalence is around 20 years of age, and then it becomes less prevalent over 50 years of age. And again, we tend to not be producing as much sebum as we age. In terms of ethnic groups, there was a study done in the US and a study done in China. African Americans, the rates of sebderm, Seb capitis, were anywhere from 81 to 95%. Caucasians, it was 30 to 42%. And in the study done in China, it was 30 to 42% of that Chinese population. Now in infants, we call it cradle cap or seborrheic capitis in infants. And it's a little bit different. For them, the sebderm can present on the scalp, the face, the retroauricular area, so common to have it on the ears and behind the ears, within body folds and on their trunks. The scalp, being cradle cap, is the most common location for infants to have it. And it is characterized by these erythematous plaques, so red, pink plaques with greasy appearing yellowish scale. It's usually self-limited, so most infants will grow out of it. In terms of prevalence, from age 0 to 3, about 10% of infants will present with cradle cap, but the peak incident is at 3 months of age, where up to 70% of infants will have cradle cap. And then by the time they get to be a year to 2 years old, it drops back down again and only 7%. I do see a fair amount of cradle cap, and I see it in conjunction with eczema. So we're going to actually look at a case study later on and look at how does this happen. So this is a condition that used to be mostly referred to as tinea versicolor, but it has since been renamed to be Pityriasis versicolor. As we know, Pityriasis and Malassezia is the same. It could be Malassezia versicolor. Basically, it's due to Malassezia yeast. So these are flaky, discolored patches. Most commonly, we're seeing on the upper trunk. We can see this on the arms, neck, and face. And we're not entirely sure, but what we think might be happening is Malassezia yeast can produce a substance called azelaic acid. It's a metabolite that gets produced. When azelaic acid is in the presence of oleic acid, it becomes a competitive inhibitor of an enzyme called tyrosinase. And tyrosinase is really critical in the production of melanin. Of course, melanin is what gives our skin pigment. So if azelaic acid is there with oleic acid and is inhibiting tyrosinase, well, then we're going to get inhibition of melanin, and we can get these like white or hypopigmented patches. And that's why we think tinea versicolor presents this way. But it can also present as kind of pink and inflamed as well. Both presentations are pretty common. And again, this is widely accepted that Malassezia is the etiological agent of tinea versicolor. And what's happening is it's undergoing conversion from the yeast to the mycelial form, and then it invades the stratum corneum and corneocyte. So it invades the top layer of the skin and the skin cells. Why this happens, we don't know. We don't fully understand this. We do know that it's recurrent. So even after a treatment course completion where they've cleared it up, recurrence rates are as high as 60 to 80% in the first and second year of treatment. So people seem to be kind of predisposed to having this happen. Now, I mentioned Malassezia in conjunction with eczema, and this really does happen a lot. I see this a lot in infants and in adults. Adults having dandruff with eczema, and infants, of course, having the cradle cap. So it's not that the Malassezia is the cause of the eczema or atopic dermatitis. It's not. And if you want to delve into eczema, I have another video on this channel all about eczema, and you'll hear about kind of what's driving eczema. But what happens with Malassezia is it can exacerbate the problem. So with eczema, we have a skin barrier defect, broken skin barriers, and that allows the Malassezia to penetrate down into the epidermal layer, and it can cause a kind of hypersensitivity reaction to the Malassezia. It doesn't belong down there. It belongs on top of the skin. And serum Malassezia specific IgE, which is an allergic immunoglobulin reaction, has been found in 30% of children with eczema and 70% of adults, particularly those with head and neck lesions, right? Again, this is where the Malassezia is really living in high amounts. If you have broken skin on the scalp or the face, the Malassezia is going to be able to get in and cause this exacerbation. And what we've seen is that it can correlate with the severity of eczema. So levels of Malassezia colonization varies depending on the severity. Patients with severe atopic dermatitis have 2 to 5 times the levels of Malassezia compared to those with mild or moderate eczema cases. So it really seems to be causing problems. All right, so let's look at what's going on with topicals. What are the more kind of conventional pharmaceutical options that are being used today? There's a lot of topical treatments that can be used. There's things that can be used for the scalp and for other areas of the skin. So antifungal agents, right? Things like ketoconazole shampoo. I think that's the most common one that I see. There can be topical steroids. So clobetasol is very strong steroid that can be used on the scalp. You can use things like hydrocortisone on the skin. And also on the skin, they're sometimes using calcineurin inhibitors like tacrolimus and pimecrolimus. These are topicals that are also used in eczema. And so they're not steroids, but they kind of function in the same vein in that they're inhibitors. They're trying to suppress inflammation. There's also the keratolytic problems where you're really trying to kind of peel off that layer of flaking. And these are, I think marginally helpful. Most of my patients have tried this and they're there seeing me because it's not worked for them. So let's look at Malassezia, because we said It's on everybody, but now it's causing dandruff. So what might be the difference? So population densities of Malassezia were assessed on the scalps of normal subjects, patients with dandruff, and then patients with seborrheic dermatitis on the skin. And what they found was those normal subjects who didn't have dandruff, they didn't have any seb derm, about 46% of the microbial flora on these subjects was Malassezia. Okay, that's normal, we said that. 74% of the flora in patients with dandruff was Malassezia. So we see this huge jump from 46% to 74% in those without dandruff and those that have it. And those patients with seb derm, it went up to 83%. So Malassezia has really taken over the microbial flora in patients with dandruff and seb derm. And I think that's the issue, is that at normal levels, the body's not concerned with Malassezia, but when it sees this spike and this overgrowth, that's where the immune response kicks in and the system becomes alarmed, and that's what's driving the inflammation. Now we know people with dandruff are scratching at their scalps, it's itchy. A lot of the seb derm rash is itchy. What's going on there? Well, the researchers found that the histamine level in the scalp stratum corneum, so the top level of the scalp, those with dandruff, the histamine level was more than twice that of those that didn't have dandruff. And in the study, they used a shampoo with zinc pyrithione, and that led to a reduction of the histamine in those with dandruff down to a normal level. And it got that way because they basically got rid of the Malassezia. So let's look at zinc pyrithione. There was a study that investigated the mechanism of action of zinc pyrithione against Malassezia restricta. And Malassezia restricta is just one of the species we looked at the beginning in that list of 18 on humans. So zinc pyrithione seems to have a multifactorial effect on Malassezia. It induces iron starvation in the cells. It increases the intracellular zinc levels in a dose-dependent fashion. And we know that zinc is antifungal. It interferes with the mitochondrial function of the Malassezia, and it inhibits the expression of lipase. And we talked about it earlier. Lipase is an enzyme that breaks down fats, right? Why is the Malassezia secreting lipase? Because it wants to break down and eat the sebum. If it can't secrete lipase, it can't eat the sebum, and it's going to starve and die. So there's a lot of different ways that the zinc pyrithione is working against Malassezia, and I definitely find shampoos with zinc pyrithione to be very, very helpful. Let's look at some essential oils, what they are. So each essential oil is, it's basically concentrated plant products, right? So let's take lavender, for example. If you take 300 pounds of lavender and put it in a big copper distiller with water and heat it up, then you distill it down, we're going to get essential oils. And when we look at the chart, we can see that the water vapor, it's so hot, right? Because of the heated water, it's going to evaporate. And so will the volatile oils. Volatile means that it will evaporate. And then it's collected into cooling units. And what's collected at the beginning and is floating on top is the essential oil. And it's really a concentrated, potent part of the plant's secondary metabolites. And each essential oil, so just like lavender essential oil, can contain many, sometimes hundreds of distinct natural chemicals. So they're very complex substances. Most essential oils have a wide spectrum of antimicrobial effects. So they can be antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, and antiprotozoal. And that is because this is what the plant uses to fight these things in nature, right? The plant has to survive against bacteria, fungus, viruses, and animals. And the essential oils, these secondary metabolites, help it. We find that there's synergistic effects with mixing multiple essential oils together. But a word of caution, essential oils are really concentrated and powerful. Use with caution on yourself and your patients. I never let my patients just do it on their own. I'm always instructing them, because you can get into trouble with essential oils because they're so powerful. You can get a contact dermatitis or a sensitization for people who are using it too much. Some of them are phototoxic, like bergamot and lime. And that means that if your patient puts them on and then goes into the sun, they can get a very dramatic third-degree burn that they'll need to be hospitalized for, and they may have scarring forever. And it's really important to know the dermal limits for each oil. What's the maximum percentage that you should put on a skin, and the limits together. And essential oils should never be applied neat. Neat means that they're applied directly to the skin. We don't want to see that, and definitely make sure that your patients are not doing that, because they don't know and they just will shake them on, and that can be very dangerous. But with those words of caution, let's look at some studies with essential oils. And I will say that I really like essential oils and I do use them a lot, and they're great against fungal organisms like Malassezia. So this was a study that was done comparing rosemary essential oil and some other essential oils against selenium sulfide. And selenium sulfide is an active ingredient found in a lot of dandruff shampoos. So they were looking at a particularly Malassezia furfur, which is just another species, and they were looking at the MIC. The MIC is the minimum inhibitory concentration. What does that mean? It's the smallest concentration of an antibacterial or antifungal agent that inhibits the growth of the bacteria or fungi. So the smaller the MIC, the more powerful the substance. And we can see that rosemary essential oil at just a 0.5% was able to, inhibit the growth of Malassezia. The selenium sulfide needed to be there in 2.5%. And they also looked at basil essential oil and coleus essential oil. But out of all of them, the rosemary was the strongest. Lemongrass essential oil was looked at for dandruff. This was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial carried out with 30 volunteers. They ranged in age from 20 to 60. And there was hair lotions that were formulated with various concentrations of lemongrass. So one bottle had a 5% lemongrass, one had a 10%, and one had a 15%. And they split up the volunteers. And what we can see is that actually the 10% solution was the most efficacious. So it's not always that more is better. And by day 7, 75% had the reductions in dandruff, and by day 17, 81%. So it was quite potent. You can also use tea tree essential oil for dandruff. I think it's pretty widely known, but this was a randomized single-blind parallel group study of those with mild to moderate dandruff. There was 126 males and females ranging in age from 14 and up. And they were either using a 5% tea tree oil shampoo or a placebo shampoo every day for 4 weeks. What we found is that those who were using the 5% tea tree oil had a 41% improvement versus just an 11% improvement in the placebo group, and no adverse effects were found. And then there was a study done of Myrtle essential oil for Pityriasis versicolor or Tinea versicolor. They had 41 patients who were diagnosed with Tinea versicolor. They'd not received any treatment for 2 weeks prior to the enrollment. And they collected 7 different Malassezia species from 86 colonies on different parts of their body. So we can see there was like Malassezia furfur, Sympodialis, globose, a bunch of different ones. They were looking at the MIC, so the minimum inhibitory concentration, and the MFC is the minimum fungicidal concentration, and they were measuring them for the Myrtle essential oil. And we can see here the inhibition percentages, and then the median MIC and the median MFC. So there was different levels of efficacy depending on the types of Malassezia subspecies, which was interesting, but we still got good results across the board with the Myrtle essential oil. And again, I do really like essential oils. They're very powerful. They're really great antifungals, but just make sure that you're using them responsibly, that you are well-versed in essential oils, and that you can guide your patients so that they can be safe in their essential oil use. Now let's talk about seborrheic dermatitis and the gut and how they might be connected. So if you've seen any of my other talks, you will know that as a naturopathic doctor, as a functional medicine doctor, our goal is always to get down and treat and find the root causes. We don't want to just be suppressing symptoms. We want to figure out what's actually wrong and correct it. And, for me, I specialize in dermatology. I go through it with the gut-skin connection. So I start with the gut dysbiosis. We know that gut dysbiosis is a driver of systemic inflammation. And systemic inflammation is a driver of chronic dermatologic disease like seborrheic dermatitis. And we've seen some of them like Tinea versicolor and some of the other ones, right? They have this chronic relapsing remitting where they're very hard to get rid of. And I think if we look at the gut, we might see some of the reason why. So just to kind of, briefly touch on the gut and our gut microbiome, I think, it's pretty well known now, but our gut microbiome impacts so much about our health. So the average adult human has 3 to 5 pounds of microbes living in their gut. And we don't just let them live there, we house them and we feed them for free. And that seems a little bit strange, but it's a commensal relationship and we've co-evolved together. We need them and they need us. So it's something that is good for us. There are trillions of organisms living in the gut. Just like with the skin, there's a lot of bacteria living on our skin and in our gut, but there's also this fungal component. And I think this fungal component of what's living in our gut can get ignored or downplayed a lot. And it's really important, particularly to some of these chronic diseases, like the ones we talked about with Malassezia. So let's start looking at one of the important fungal organisms in our gut, and that is Candida. So Candida is a yeast, a single-celled fungal organism. So just like Malassezia, both of them are yeasts. The genus of Candida includes approximately 200 different species, so there's a lot of them. And Candida can also take a yeast form and a hyphae form. And that hyphae form, just like the Malassezia, the Candida hyphae can invade tissues, and Candida can also form biofilms. Now, Candida is also found in low numbers on healthy adult skin, and it's part of the normal flora of the mucous membranes of the respiratory, gastrointestinal, and female genital tracts. But when our mucosal barriers are disrupted or when the immune system is compromised, Candida can invade and then cause disease, either through opportunistic overcolonization or infection. So it's similar to that Malassezia, right? We can get the overcolonization on the skin of Malassezia. We can get overcolonization in the gut of Candida. Now, Candida is the most common cause of fungal infections worldwide. And one of the causes is antibiotics. Antibiotics are still prescribed quite widely, and they promote fungal infections because they kill off the bacteria that actually help to keep Candida in check, like lactobacillus. Bacteria creates lactic acid, and so that's why I think a lot of people know that particularly women, when they take antibiotics, they are at risk for getting vaginal yeast infections, and that's why. So what about opportunistic Candida, right? Because Candida can be commensal, but it can be opportunistic. So it produces proteinase that breaks down collagen and keratin on the skin and in our gut. And it also drives the production of IgA and complement, and it can increase vascular permeability. In the presence of Candida, the immune system has a reduced ability to kill off organisms like Staphylococcus aureus, E. coli, and C. difficile. So not great. But it has been shown that Candida presence inhibits the virulence of Pseudomonas. So there are maybe some advantages to having Candida, but there's a lot of problems with it. Now, we talked about that antifungal Th17 immunity is related to Malassezia. Well, there's a big connection with Candida as well. There was this study, and the name of the study was Human Antifungal Th17 Immunity and Pathology Rely on Cross-Reactivity Against Candida albicans. And basically, this whole study explains that these Th17 cells that we looked at earlier provides protection for us at barrier tissues. So researchers identified that Candida albicans is the major inducer of the human antifungal Th17 cells. So they're kind of like priming our Th17 cells and teaching them at university what it's like to see fungal elements and how to react against it. So if you have intestinal inflammation with an overgrowth of C. albicans, you're going to be driving production of Th17 cells. And there's a cross-reactivity because they're trained against Candida, which is maybe one of the reasons why we have it and we allow it to live there. But then those trained cells can go cross-react with other fungal organisms. So it's been shown that locally induced Th17 cells, they are antigen specific against Candida, but they can migrate to peripheral organs like the skin. And in those peripheral areas, they can be activated by local fungi. So can be activated by something like Malassezia. And we've seen this. There's another study that is called Cross-Reacting IgE Antibodies to Pityriasis ovale and Candida albicans in Atopic Children. So this study looked at children with eczema and IgE antibodies. Again, these are true allergic antibodies, but there was cross-reactivity between the IgE antibodies reacting to Candida albicans and Pityriasis or Malassezia ovale. Malassezia ovale is just another species. We've seen lots of different species, but it's all, Malassezia. So in this test, they collected serum from 13 patients, 13 kids with eczema that were positive for Pityriasis ovale skin prick test. And of the 13 samples, 8 showed IgE, allergic binding to P. ovale, and 6 to Candida albicans, and 5 showed simultaneous IgE cross-binding to the Candida and the Pityriasis or Malassezia. So that cross-binding, right, that's what we're talking about, where it was trained on Candida albicans, but it's reacting to another yeast, to Malassezia, in the same way. And the researchers concluded, their statement was, this suggested cross-reactivity may imply an interesting phenomenon in atopics who are sensitized by C. albicans growth in the gastrointestinal tract and get exposed by P. ovale growing on the skin. Overgrowth of Candida in the gut can cause this cross-reactive immune response to Malassezia on the skin. Now, again, I said my method is for treating these chronic complex derm issues is to test and treat the gut. And so I'm going to take you through some case studies now and show you how do I treat these Malassezia issues by going for the gut. We're also going to go for the skin, but to really get down to that root cause, you know, why would these things be reoccurring? Why can't we just get rid of them? We got to go to the gut. So what are functional medicine tests? Well, you're here on the Rupa Labs channel, so chances are that you know what these are, or maybe you use them already. But in case you don't, you know, there's so many types of functional medicine tests, and these are additional tests beyond standard conventional blood work to help us get answers. And there's 2 that I use consistently. Every patient who walks in my door before I see them for the first visit, they have to do a GI map stool test, and they have to do an oat organic acid test. So there's the stool test, which is poop, and the oat test is a urine test. And I'm going to show you what some of my patients and what their examples are. Now, why I do stool testing is it does a tremendously good job at identifying bacteria in the gut. Is there enough of the commensal or good guy bacteria? What is overgrowing that should not be there or should not be overgrowing? There is some analysis of fungal and yeast elements, parasites like protozoa and worms, some viruses. There's also a lot of digestive information on the stool test, things like steatocrit, which is how much fat is in the stool, which is a good proxy for bile, and elastase, which are pancreatic enzymes. Some have short-chain fatty acid analysis. There are inflammatory markers on the stool test like calprotectin, lactoferrin, and secretory IgA, and some permeability markers like zonulin. For the oat, I do that a lot. There's really good information on yeast and fungal markers, and so I like to cross-reference and do both tests for patients. And then I get the results, I look at them together, and I use the lab results as a roadmap for how I'm going to get my patient clear. I know where we are now, right? We've got rashes and dandruff and sebderm and tinea versicolor and all that stuff. I know I want to get them clear, and the lab results I use as my roadmap to get there. So my clinical experience with my sebderm patients, I tend to see high levels of Candida. I can see high levels of mold overgrowth and mycotoxins. Now, mycotoxins, we haven't talked so much about them, but what are they? So there's mold and fungal elements, and those are the actual organisms. Well, mycotoxins are toxic secondary metabolites produced by mold and fungi. So they do this because they are trying to defend themselves against other microbial organisms, whether it's bacterial or fungal. The mycotoxins, they put them out into the air, and then they go off and kill the oncoming invaders. The mold and fungal elements are not trying to harm us, but we are kind of collateral damage, and mycotoxins are capable of causing disease and death in both humans and animals. So I don't talk about it as much here, but it can be related to the sebderm. I do end up doing a lot of mycotoxin testing on patients as well, and it can be really helpful to get to the root cause as well. All right, so let's get to the good stuff. Let's look at some case studies and see how do you put this all together to treat things like sebderm and dandruff and cradle cap and tinea versicolor. All right, we're going to look at 2 cases. Our first case is going to be a 29-year-old female. And this female, we're going to call her Faith, but that's not her real name. And we can see she's got a bunch of issues going on. So she's got dandruff, sebderm on the face, and tinea versicolor on her back. And this is not uncommon. It's what I refer to as my fungally patients. So, all of us, I think, have kind of innate abilities to fight certain things better than others. And in this case, Faith is a fungally patient, which means that her weakness is fungal problems. And she's got 3 different ones. So she says she's had dandruff as long as she can remember. She's had a face rash for 13 years. And of course, the face rash is seborrheic dermatitis. And then she's had a back rash for about the last 5 or 6 years. And that back rash is the tinea versicolor or Pityriasis versicolor. Again, the Malassezia. So all 3 of these things are a Malassezia yeast problem. It's just manifesting in different ways. Her face rash, or sebderm of the face, waxes and wanes, but she's dealing with rashes on her face 20 out of 30 days of every month. Now, anytime you have a patient dealing with stuff on their face, it's going to really increase the severity of that to a patient, because obviously our face is how we present to the world. And when you've got rashes and flaking and stuff like that, it's hard to feel confident and good. Like, it really does impact patients. In the scalp, hopefully you can see in this picture, there's that kind of plaquing there. And then on the back, all the white dots and discoloration, that is the tinea versicolor. So she's tried steroid creams, medicated shampoos like the ketoconazole. Some of them have been like a temporary fix, but again, after a few days, it returns, and she's dealing with this most days out of the month. And so it's really a chronic, annoying condition for her. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to run that GI map stool test and an oat on her. So let's look at some of her stool test results. We can see, first of all, she has some Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori. So that's, a moderate amount, but I still treat all H. pylori that I see. Overall, for her normal bacterial flora, we're seeing that she has overall low. So if we look down here at the phyla, we see 2 phyla listed, Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. Together, these 2 phyla are giving us a snapshot of about 85% of the good gut bacteria. And so overall, she's low, and this is problematic. This is what I refer to as insufficiency dysbiosis. She has insufficient amounts of the good gut bacteria, and that is impeding her body's ability to do its job to fight things like Malassezia and just function in a normal manner. So this is really significant. We've got to increase the commensal bacteria. One of the ways you'll see me talk about is through fiber. Fiber is the main food of these bacteria. When we look up into this section here, we see some independent individual species and genuses. And we see that, for example, there's no Akkermansia muciniphila. That's important because Akkermansia muciniphila is a keystone species, and it helps prevent leaky gut. We can see that she's got some other low organisms as well. But then in the immune response, we see that there's a very high level of inflammation. So she has high secretory IgA and high anti-gliadin IgA. Gliadin is a glycoprotein found in gluten. So high anti-gliadin IgA means that she is having a reaction to gluten. And anytime you see this, you're going to want to try taking that individual off of gluten. Now, it's hard to know, is her total secretory IgA being driven high by the gluten, or are there other factors? The first thing to do would be, again, to take her off the gluten. But there's a high inflammatory response in her gut right now. And that's also, I think, causing inflammation and problems for her. On her oat, we see a couple of things. Number 7, arabinose, is kind of a proxy for candida overgrowth. And we see that she does have an overgrowth of candida in her gut. And remember, we saw high overgrowth of candida in the gut can drive that reaction, that Th17 reaction, to Malassezia on the skin. So this is certainly something we're going to want to look at. Now, the oat also has these indicators of detoxification section, and we can see that her pyroglutamic acid is high. Pyroglutamic acid has an asterisk. That means it's an inverse marker. When pyroglutamic acid is high, her glutathione is low. Of course, glutathione is the major antioxidant of the body. And her methylation toxic exposure marker, the 2-hydroxybutyric acid, is high. These 2, or even 1 alone, can mean that there's a toxic problem. Now, I wanted to do mycotoxin testing on this patient. I was suspicious that that could be a problem. She decided she didn't want to do it, so we didn't, but I suspect that there probably was a mycotoxin issue. So what am I going to do to help this patient? The first thing to note is that these protocols are naturopathic, so they are individualized protocols. This is not what I do for every patient with seb derm of the face, dandruff, and tinea versicolor, right? This is what I do for this patient because this is what's happening in her body and in her gut labs. And protocols change about every 2 to 3 months. So I see patients approximately every 2.5 months for follow-up, and the plans are going to change each time. So what you're going to see, it's not that I treated her with this all at one time. Definitely not. There were multiple visits, and we're going to look at some photos and progression of her skin from visit to visit. But this is just a snapshot of the things that I treated her with. So for H. pylori overgrowth, well, for everything I should mention, you know, I'm a naturopathic doctor and I treat with herbs and supplements, and I rarely use pharmaceuticals. So all of this was, you know, natural things. For H. pylori, things like mastic gum, DGL, zinc carnosine, bismuth. For her low commensal bacteria, certainly probiotics, but also those 35 grams of fiber a day that I mentioned. For her fungal overgrowth, wonderful, beautiful antifungal herbs like neem, pau d'arco, uva ursi, caprylic acid, and clove. Definitely eliminated gluten with those high anti-gliadin IgA results. For the possible mycotoxins, since we couldn't test, I did do binders and glutathione. And for her skin barrier and skin microbes, I use that zinc Pyrithione shampoo. We use a little bit of rosemary essential oil and jojoba oil as well. I like jojoba oil for Malassezia because while we call it jojoba oil, it is actually a waxy ester. And why that is important is that, as we discussed, Malassezia is a lipophilic yeast. It wants to eat oil. And jojoba being a waxy ester, Malassezia can't really utilize it so well as a food source. So I like using jojoba oil on Malassezia issues because we're not feeding it with the oil, or we're using a waxy ester, and it tends to go better. So here's an example of her progression on this eye spot seb derm. So we can see all this flaking and redness and stuff. After 2.5 months of treatment, we see that things are greatly improved. There's not as much redness, not as much flaking. Another 2.5 months, basically she's clear. And another 4.5 months, the eye is still clear. So she's really happy about the progress on her eye. For her scalp, we can see at the first visit, there's flaking and a plaque here. The plaque is gone after 2.5 months, but we can still see flaking. This next 2.5 month follow-up, she had been on a cruise with her family and had indulged in sugar and alcohol and all sorts of things that feeds Malassezia. So we do see an uptick, but then at the 4.5 month mark, she's basically clear on the scalp. This is her tinea versicolor. We can see the progression at 2.5 months, an improvement. Things are looking really good at that third visit. At the 4.5 month mark, she said she had basically not been using the topicals and she's a little more tan. So we see a little bit of resurgence, but it's still a big improvement from the first visit. All right, and let's look at our second and last case study. So now we're going to be looking at a 7-month-old male, and this infant has cradle cap and eczema, which you're going to see a lot, both again in your infant and adult patients. All right, so we are going to call this patient Oscar, not his real name, but this is a 7-month-old male, and he's had eczema since birth. He's developed some bad cradle cap. His scalp is itching a lot, and he will scratch at it until he bleeds. This is unfortunately something that is common when in pediatric patients with eczema and cradle cap. The itch is worse than pain, so they will scratch themselves bloody. This is obviously alarming for parents, but it can open up the skin and cause infection. So we really do want to avoid this. Mom is making and using an herbal extract salve and trying to moisturize, but it's not helping. And his gut is also off. He has diarrhea, there's a visible mucus and a slimy liquid, and he has a lot of gas. So next steps, let's do a GI map stool test and an OAT. So let's look at some of his stool test results. So he actually had a pathogen show up, and while it's a very low amount, any amount of enteroinvasive E. coli Shigella, we definitely don't want. So we want to clean that up. He has a very high level of that H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. His normal bacteria he does have a leaky gut picture. So he's missing that Akkermansia muciniphila. He's also missing Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which is a butyrate producer, and together, no or low Akkermansia muciniphila, no or low Faecalibacterium prausnitzii kind of is a picture of leaky gut. He's got a lot of overgrowth of dysbiotic or unwanted bacteria. We see a high amount of Pseudomonas. There's Staph aureus, Streptococcus, Klebsiella. For me, the ones on this that are the worst are the Pseudomonas and the Klebsiella. They're LPS or endotoxin producers, and they really do drive inflammation in the system. We can see on his stool test, he's showing up with a lot of Candida overgrowth. He also has inflammation in his gut, so he has very high secretory IgA, I think in response to the pathogen and the other microbes here. And he has very high calprotectin, so that's colonic inflammation. And again, anytime I see a pathogen, it can be related to that, but there's just a lot of overgrowth going on. And usually this resolves itself after treatment and retesting. We don't see that anymore. On his oat, we see a very high level of Candida overgrowth. He also has some Clostridia overgrowth. And he also has low glutathione. Remember, this is an inverse marker. When pyroglutamic acid is high, glutathione is low, and high methylation and toxic exposure marker. I also would have liked to run a mycotoxin on this patient, but parent opted not to, so unfortunately I didn't. But same thing with this patient, individualized protocol, seeing this patient every 2 to 3 months for follow-up. So for H. pylori, I'm doing things like black cumin seed and meadowsweet. For the bacterial overgrowth, you know, a wide range of herbs, but oregano, coptis, and others. And for fungal overgrowth, you know, things like rosemary and neem. For his leaky gut, there are butyrate supplements for that low Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and L-glutamine. And for the possible mycotoxins, binders, and glutathione. And then again, for the skin barrier support, the Zinc Pyrithione shampoo, and also some botanical topicals that I worked with Mom on. So how did he do? This was him at the first visit, and here he is just 1.5 months later, a dramatic cleanup, a reduction in that itching and flaking, and much better. And then also for the eczema, so you can see that in between these folds, usually when you're seeing redness in the folds like this, it is more fungal, and you can see that that cleaned up as well. So all around, a big improvement. It works on all kinds of sebderm. So here's an example. We see this patient with a lot of erythema and that flaking in the glabella area here, and cleaned up. Here we see an all over seborrheic dermatitis and an improvement all over. Here again, a lot of flaking and issues. We see the nasolabial folds, but it's kind of all over, and a much better picture here. We see dandruff in an adult patient, and with the flaking and the redness, and much better here. And again, more of the seborrheic dermatitis, the glabella all over, and that's been cleaned up as well. This infant with pretty dramatic cradle cap, this infant was really being tortured by it, and just a vast improvement. And then this patient, again, we see these nasolabial fold areas and a dramatic improvement in the sebderm. So does it work for other dermatologic conditions? It does. This is the method that I use. You can find other videos on here. I speak about a lot of derm topics, but it's how I approach acne and eczema and psoriasis and all of these diseases. I first go to the gut. I do the GI map and oat. I analyze and treat, but then I'm also treating the skin. And each disease is different in particular. So you're going to have different things going on with each disease, but it really does work. Now, if you are interested in really getting into dermatology and treating patients like this that you've seen and getting these kinds of results, I do have a course. It's the Root Cause Functional Dermatology course for professionals, and it really goes into depth on 7 dermatologic disease states, how you can treat this way and get these kinds of results. So the 7 diseases that you'll be trained on are acne, eczema, seborrheic dermatitis, psoriasis, rosacea, hair loss, and keratosis pilaris. I take you through in depth how to analyze and do a GI map, a Dutch hormone test, an oat test, a mycotoxin test. We go through things like treating H. pylori and SIBO. So we really trained on how to do it all, plus all the topicals. There are 35 case studies with labs and treatment plans and photos. So for these patients, for example, instead of just seeing a general, well, here's kind of what you do, you would see each treatment plan, exactly what was prescribed, both oral and topical, at each and every plan. So there's 35 case studies, and you would be going through hundreds of treatment plans for these patients. And the idea is to get you up and running as a functional dermatology professional, being able to treat these conditions. For licensed healthcare providers who take the there's a live 4-month cohort. It's really great because you get listed in our Find a Practitioner database, and I send patients to you who are looking for this exact kind of medicine. There are 2 courses. There's that live 4-month mentorship, like I mentioned, for licensed healthcare providers. There's also a self-paced course. And to find out more, go to rootcausedermatology.com. That's rootcausedermatology.com, and you'll see the offerings there. And of course, if you are interested in ordering these functional medicine tests, you're at the Rupa Labs channel, and lucky for you, you can go to Rupa Labs and you can order them there. So for example, you saw the GI map, stool test, and the OAT. Rupa makes it really easy. You just go in, enter patient information once, and then you just tick off the labs that you want that patient to have, and Rupa will take care of the rest of it. It's really convenient. They deal with instructions and helping the patient to get the labs done. And if anything goes wrong, Rupa's going to help troubleshoot that, and you're not going to be bothered with it. So check out rootcausedermatology.com for my courses, and check out Rupa Labs so that you can easily order these labs for your patients. And I hope this has been helpful, and I hope to see you again in some of my other talks. Have a great day. Bye.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.